And of course, all of this was as a result of, broadly speaking, the failure of the policy of apartheid, which I outlined in the last lecture. Why did apartheid fail? Well, not only because it was an immoral policy which perpetuated inequality amongst people, it failed for all sorts of reasons. And I'm just going to run through them quickly, because if I was doing a university course on this, which I sometimes do, this slide and the next slide alone would be the topic of a week-long series of lectures, if not more. The stalemate that existed in the country between those who were the oppressors or the minority government and those who were in resistance, that stalemate meant that the country could go no further. It was time for change. Internal order and security had broken down in part. There was still order in part of South Africa, but clearly the security forces and police establishment were finding it more and more difficult to police the uprisings and protests which were happening across the country. Effectively, there was an increasing cost of retaining white power. More and more cash had to be ploughed into the military, the army, and the police force in order to repress unrest across the country. And of course, with sanctions, international pressure, and disinvestment causing economic stagnation in the country, it became more difficult for the ruling government to raise taxes, to raise enough funds to fund the security establishment, which has as its main task the protection of the government of the day. Then another very important reason as to why apartheid really failed, or why we saw change at this particular time, it was not unrelated to what was happening in other parts of the world. It's not just coincidental that in 1989 we saw the failure of the South African system of apartheid in the same year that the Berlin Wall collapsed in East Germany. The same year that the Soviet Union effectively fell apart. Over the previous 30 years or so, the Soviet Union had been the major backer of the black resistance movements in South Africa. With the end of the power of the Soviet Union and the end of their ability to fund guerrilla organizations in Africa, and in particular in our case, the African National Congress, the white rulers felt that they would be able to perhaps negotiate from a position of relative strength. The Soviet Union would no longer be the financial backers, the money bags, behind the African National Congress, the group that eventually would have to take over power in South Africa. So the end of the Cold War and collapse of communism was a very important reason as to why negotiations were in the air, or at least there was a mood for negotiations in the air. Over the course of the last 30 years prior to 1989, and in particular in the previous 15 years, there have been all sorts of attempts by the ruling National Party to change the constitution of South Africa, to introduce new kinds of expression, political expression for black South Africans, the homeland policy as I outlined in the previous lecture. Well, as I mentioned, this policy was a failure. It was not going to stand the test of people that it was designed to cater for, the black South Africans. The failure of the homeland policy and the failure of a number of other constitutional policies that were implemented also contributed to the end of apartheid. You will also remember that in the early 1980s, I didn't even mention it in the last lecture, one of the guests here reminded me, the ruling white National Party tried to introduce separate parliaments for Indian and mixed-race coloured South Africans, and indeed went ahead in creating a separate parliamentary chamber for these two minority groups. Black South Africans were expressly excluded because it was argued they would have their political expression in these various homelands that I outlined. But no coloured leaders or no Indian leaders of any great stature accepted this Indian-only parliament, or white or coloured-only parliament, again creating a failure in the government's attempts to co-opt and bring in some black leadership into their various plans. The independence of Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Angola, and Mozambique, again, also contributed to pressure on the white government in South Africa. And in addition, I might add that it was also important from the white government's point of view to take all of these factors into account, and if they were going to negotiate a settlement in South Africa, rather negotiate a settlement with the one person in the black struggle who could effectively be the most credible leader, i.e. Nelson Mandela. You can imagine, if for whatever reason Nelson Mandela had passed away during his time in detention during the 1980s, he would have been a martyr, a figure really then of the struggle. And it would have been even more difficult for the white government to negotiate a settlement without Mandela. So it was critical for the white government that Mandela come out of prison, and come out of prison in a relatively healthy state in order to take South Africa further. And we can put this all into a big pot if we're looking for the recipe as to why everything really fell apart within South Africa. The country itself was integrating, despite all of the laws that separated people socially, politically, and economically. Nevertheless, with such demographic features, 80% of our population is black, 20% are minority groups, there was bound to be integration, even with legislation to prevent that. And that integration gained momentum during the course of the 1980s, even in a fairly repressive environment. All of these factors, it's a bit like a recipe for the failure of a policy, put all of these factors together.